When European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the new EU-US trade deal, it was immediately controversial. European commentators and some leaders derided it as a capitulation, and noted that not only was the deal one-sided, it also threatened to undermine Europe's reputation as a champion of the rules-based order, given that the zero tariffs promised for US imports would cut against the EU's World Trade Organization obligations to treat all trading partners equally. Nonetheless, von der Leyen and her allies argued that the admittedly one-sided deal was the only way to avoid a full-scale transatlantic trade war and guarantee Trump's continued support for Ukraine. Unfortunately for von der Leyen, in the past couple of weeks, it looks like the deal has started to fall apart. A number of senior EU officials have come out against it, and the Socialists grouping has now said they won't vote for the relevant tariff reductions when they're put before the European Parliament. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the deal, why it's falling apart, and whether von der Leyen can salvage it. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. So let's start with a quick recap of what was actually in the deal. In short, Trump introduced a 15% tariff on most EU imports coming into the US, far higher than the effective tariff rate on EU imports before Trump, but lower than the 20% rate that Trump threatened on Liberation Day or the 30% Trump threatened in his letter to the EU in July. In exchange for this lower than expected tariff rate, the EU apparently made 3 concessions. First, the EU agreed to put zero tariffs on most US imports coming into the EU, although it's worth saying that the EU didn't really have too many tariffs on the US in the first place. Second, over the next 3 years, the EU agreed to buy $750 billion in American energy products, $40 billion of American-made chips, and an unspecified amount of US military gear. Third, the EU agreed to invest an additional $600 billion in the US over the next 3 years. Now, at first glance, this doesn't look like a great deal from the EU's perspective. Sure, the EU got a lower tariff rate than Trump threatened on Liberation Day, but a 15% tariff is still way higher than the status quo, and unprecedented in recent history. Nor does it look like Trump made any concessions. Rather, the EU agreed to drop its tariff rate on US imports even further, and apparently agreed to spend hundreds of billions of euros on American stuff. Nonetheless, von der Leyen and her allies defended the deal on 2 grounds. First, they argued that the EU didn't really have much leverage in negotiations with the US. The EU relies more on trade with the US than vice versa, because the EU runs a trade surplus with the US, which means European producers rely more on the American market to provide demand. But second, in private, von der Leyen's allies argued that they needed to make a deal with Trump to keep him on side vis-à-vis Ukraine. Only a few weeks earlier, the White House had suddenly paused deliveries of certain munitions to Ukraine, and von der Leyen's defenders argued that a one-sided trade deal was a necessary price to pay for keeping America's famously fickle president on side in Ukraine. However, almost as soon as it was announced, von der Leyen's deal started to fall apart. For starters, observers quickly noticed how implausible, or even impossible, some of the commitments were. The biggest and most obvious problem is that, legally speaking, the European Commission doesn't have the power to force European companies to buy American products or invest in the US. But even if the Commission could somehow find a way to pressure European businesses to reorient themselves towards the US, the numbers involved still look, well, a bit silly. The EU's commitment to buy $750 billion in US energy products before 2028, for instance, implies buying about $250 billion worth of the stuff a year, about triple what the EU spent in 2024. Furthermore, the US only exported $166 billion worth of energy products in 2024, and US energy production will probably fall in 2025, given that global oil prices are currently too low for US shale producers to make a profit. Now, in a sense that these commitments are implausible isn't necessarily a bad thing from von der Leyen's perspective. It sort of implies that she played Trump by promising him something that was never going to happen just to placate him. You might have expected this to help the deal find support in Europe, given other European countries would presumably be more likely to support it if they don't think they'll actually have to follow through on its more controversial and costly elements. Unfortunately for von der Leyen, this doesn't seem to have been enough, and it increasingly looks like the deal won't make it through the European Parliament. The first signs of this came last week, when the EU's Industrial Strategy Commissioner suggested the deal should be reviewed, and Teresa Ribera, the European Commission's Executive Vice President, who's second only to Ursula von der Leyen in the Commission's power structure, told the Financial Times that the EU should be ready to walk away from the deal if Trump continued to press for changes to the EU's digital regulations, especially the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Ribera's comments came a couple of days after Trump implied that he would impose new tariffs and maybe even sanctions on countries that imposed any digital regulations, despite the fact that the US had already, unsuccessfully, pressed for changes to the EU's digital regulations during earlier negotiations. Things then got even tougher for von der Leyen on Monday, when, in a keynote speech at the Bled Strategic Forum in Slovenia, European Council President Antonio Costa apparently admitted that Ukraine-related security anxieties were indeed a factor in the trade deal negotiations, something von der Leyen herself hasn't publicly admitted, and seemed to echo Ribera's sentiment, warning Trump that, quote, "our partners, including the US, must know that the EU will always defend its sovereignty." The same day, the Socialists and Democrats group in the European Parliament came out and said that they wouldn't vote for the deal when it came before the European Parliament. For context, the Commission needs parliamentary approval to reduce tariffs, which, under the terms of the deal, has to happen before the US reduces its tariffs on European car imports, which are currently set at 27.5% and have been wreaking havoc with the European car industry. Without the support of the Socialists, the second largest grouping in the European Parliament, it's not clear von der Leyen can muster a majority, as the other three groups that typically support her, namely the EPP, Renew and the Greens, only have 318 seats in the 720-seat chamber. Now, of course, it's very possible von der Leyen will ultimately muster a majority, as she usually does. But the longer Europe looks at the deal, the less it likes it, especially given Trump's Ukraine policy is yet to bear fruit. Now, when you're diving into complicated topics such as this, it's quite easy to get caught up in what you know without even missing a beat. But what about the stories you don't see? Or what happens when the stories you do see are purposefully leaving out information to try and sway your thinking? Thankfully, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at helping with just that. Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles from around the world and puts them all in one place for you to easily compare how news is being covered by different outlets online. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting on it, as well as the political bias, factuality, and ownership of said sources. For example, if we take this story on the US-EU trade deal, you can see that there are 882 sources reporting on it, with 131 of them coming from the left and 112 coming from the right. You can even compare the headlines to see what either side is saying, with the left framing the trade deal primarily as a diplomatic win that forestalls the 30% tariff, in contrast to the right, which portrays the agreement as a definitive Trump victory. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of super handy features. Our personal favourite is their blind spot feed. Here you can find stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, helping you challenge your perspective on someone else's media reality. Here at TLDR, we're passionate about helping you understand how bias may affect the media you consume, something Ground News also firmly believes in. Because of this, we're offering 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. You can only access this discount through our link, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.